The Mughal Dynasty, from the Peacock Throne to a Kolkata slum. For more than 3 centuries, one family ruled over one of the richest and most powerful civilizations on earth. The Mughal Empire stretched from the mountains of Afghanistan to Bengal, from Kashmir to the Deccan. Its emperors commanded enormous armies. Its rulers built the Taj Mahal, the Red Fort, and the Gardens of Kashmir. Its courts produced some of South Asia's greatest poetry, art, architecture, and literature. At its height, Mughal India accounted for roughly a quarter of the world's economic output. And then, almost overnight, the dynasty that had ruled India for generations was broken. 3 Mughal princes were shot without trial. An 82-year-old emperor was arrested inside his own capital, tried in the palace his ancestors had built, and exiled thousands of miles away. His family scattered. Some descendants became servants. Some became beggars. And generations later, members of the same royal family were living in poverty, with one descendant eventually filing a legal claim to the Red Fort itself. This is the extraordinary story of the fall of the Mughal dynasty and what happened to the people who were left behind. The empire at its height. To understand the tragedy of the Mughals, you first have to understand what they had lost. The dynasty began in 1526, when Babur defeated Ibrahim Lodi at the First Battle of Panipat. Babur was a descendant of Timur and, through his maternal line, connected to the Mongol dynasty of Genghis Khan. His descendants would build an empire that eventually dominated much of the Indian subcontinent. Under emperors such as Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb, Mughal power reached extraordinary heights. By the late 17th century, the empire controlled enormous territories and governed well over 100 million people. Economic historian Angus Maddison estimated that India accounted for around 24% of global GDP in 1700. The Mughal court reflected that wealth. The Red Fort in Delhi became the center of imperial power. Its marble halls were decorated with precious stones and elaborate carvings. The emperor's court was filled with poets, scholars, musicians, painters, architects, soldiers, and officials. The Mughal rulers did not simply control territory. They helped create a culture that would shape South Asia for centuries. Persian flourished at court. Urdu developed into a major literary language. Poetry became an essential part of elite life. And the imperial family lived behind walls that separated them from ordinary life. Princes were trained in warfare, administration, languages, literature, and religion. Princesses lived within the zenana, the women's quarters of the palace, surrounded by servants and attendants. The rituals of court were elaborate. Even a child approaching the emperor could be expected to bow repeatedly before taking a seat. For generations, Mughal princes and princesses grew up believing that the palace was the natural center of their world. But empires rarely collapse in a single day. The Mughal decline had already begun long before the final emperor. The empire becomes a shadow. When Emperor Aurangzeb died in 1707, the empire entered a period of political instability. Regional powers challenged Mughal authority. The Marathas expanded. Provincial governors increasingly acted independently. Foreign invasions devastated Delhi. In 1739, Persian ruler Nader Shah invaded the city and carried away enormous amounts of treasure including the famous Peacock Throne. The Mughal emperor still existed. But increasingly, the emperor was becoming a symbol rather than a ruler. Then another power began to rise. The British East India Company. During the 18th century, the company expanded its military and political influence across India. By the 19th century, the Mughal emperor's authority had been reduced to little more than Delhi itself. And that was the world inherited by Bahadur Shah Zafar. The last Mughal emperor. Bahadur Shah Zafar became emperor in 1837. He was already in his 60s. Unlike the great warrior emperors of earlier generations, Zafar was primarily a poet, scholar, and spiritual figure. He wrote poetry under the pen name Zafar, meaning victory. The irony would become devastating. He lived inside the Red Fort, but he did not truly control the empire outside it. The British East India Company paid him a pension. He had little independent military power. His authority was largely ceremonial. Yet his name still mattered enormously. For Indians who remembered the Mughal past, he represented the legitimacy of the old imperial order. And Zafar himself understood how temporary power could be. His poetry repeatedly returned to themes of exile, death, loss, and the passing of time. Then, in 1857, the world around him exploded. The Revolt of 1857. In May 1857, Indian soldiers serving in the East India Company's army rebelled. The uprising spread rapidly. Rebel soldiers marched toward Delhi and entered the city. Then they went to the Red Fort. And they demanded that Bahadur Shah Zafar become the symbolic leader of the rebellion. Zafar was 82 years old. He knew exactly how dangerous this was. He had almost no army of his own. He had no realistic way to defeat the British. But the rebels needed his name. The Mughal name could unite people who otherwise had little in common. Reluctantly, Zafar became the figurehead of the uprising. His eldest son, Mirza Mughal, became involved in the administration of rebel Delhi. But the rebellion was chaotic. Different groups followed different commanders. Food became scarce. Disease spread. And outside the city, British forces prepared to retake Delhi. The siege lasted for months. Inside the Red Fort, the world of the Mughals was collapsing. The night everything ended. By September 1857, Delhi was starving. The imperial palace was no longer a place of luxury. It was a place of fear. One account from the emperor's family describes the final days with heartbreaking simplicity. There was almost nothing to eat. A young child cried for milk, but the women caring for her were too hungry to produce any. The emperor sat with his prayer beads. He knew that the city was about to fall. And he knew that his family could not remain together. Some members of the royal household escaped before the final collapse. Others hid wherever they could. Zafar himself fled to Humayun's tomb, the great mausoleum of his ancestors. There, surrounded by the graves of earlier Mughal rulers, the last emperor waited. On September 20, 1857, British officer William Hodson arrived. Zafar surrendered. He was promised that his life would be spared. But the same mercy was not extended to his sons. The prince's execution. The following day, Hodson returned for 3 members of the royal family. They included Mirza Mughal, Mirza Isra Sultan, and Mirza Abu Bakr. They surrendered. They were placed in a cart. But on the journey toward Delhi, near the Kuni Darwaza, the Gate of Blood, Hodson ordered them out. He shot all 3. There was no formal trial. No lengthy legal proceeding. Just 3 princes of the Mughal dynasty, executed in the aftermath of the rebellion. Their bodies were reportedly stripped and displayed publicly. For Zafar, the news was devastating. His sons were dead. His empire was gone. And he knew that he was next. The emperor on trial. The British brought Bahadur Shah Zafar back to the Red Fort. But this time, he entered as a prisoner. The place where his ancestors had held imperial courts became the location of his trial. The proceedings lasted several weeks. He faced charges including supporting the rebellion and assuming sovereignty during the uprising. Zafar's defense was essentially that he had been forced into the position. He had been an elderly pensioner with almost no real power. But the British had already decided what would happen to the Mughal dynasty. He was found guilty. He was not executed. Instead, the British chose something they considered safer: exile. They would remove him from India permanently. On October 7, 1858, the last Mughal emperor left Delhi. He was 83 years old. His wife, Zenat Mahal, accompanied him. The journey took him thousands of miles away from the city where his ancestors had ruled. The emperor, who once belonged to a dynasty that commanded armies and enormous wealth, was now travelling under British guard in a simple bullock cart. His destination was Rangoon, Burma. He would never see Delhi again. The last days of Zafar. In Rangoon, Zafar was confined to a small compound. His world had become painfully small. There was no imperial court. No army. No palace. No throne. Only exile. He continued to write poetry. He prayed. And he grew increasingly weak. His health deteriorated until even eating became difficult. On November 7, 1862, Bahadur Shah Zafar died. He was 87. The British deliberately kept his burial simple. They feared that a grand tomb could become a political symbol. So the last Mughal emperor was buried quietly in an obscure location. There was no magnificent imperial funeral. No great monument. For decades, even the precise location of his grave was forgotten. The dynasty that had once built some of India's greatest monuments had been reduced to an unmarked grave in a foreign land. But Zafar's death was only the beginning of the tragedy. Because many members of his family were still alive. And they had nowhere to go. When princes became beggars. After the British captured Delhi, Mughal property was confiscated. The Red Fort was transformed into a military installation. Many of its buildings and gardens were demolished. Royal possessions were seized. The Mughal court was abolished. The surviving members of the dynasty scattered across India. And they were not prepared for ordinary life. They had grown up surrounded by servants. Now they had to find food. Some royal descendants sought work. Some depended on small pensions. Others fell into extreme poverty. Accounts collected decades later described descendants of the Mughal family working as servants in households whose ancestors might once have bowed before their family. One grandson of Bahadur Shah Zafar was reportedly reduced to begging in the streets of Delhi. He suffered from paralysis and moved through neighborhoods with a cloth bag around his neck. Another royal descendant reportedly begged only at night because he could not bear the humiliation of asking for money in daylight. The contrast was almost impossible to comprehend. These were descendants of people who had once entered Delhi surrounded by imperial ceremony. Now they walked through those same streets hoping someone would give them enough money to eat. The princesses who lost everything. The women of the royal family suffered as well. When Delhi fell, many princesses fled with almost nothing. Some were separated from their families. Some became refugees. Some died from disease and hunger. One account describes a young Mughal princess fleeing Delhi with her sister. They had grown up inside the protected world of the palace. Then, suddenly, they were walking barefoot through unfamiliar roads. They had no food. No protection. No servants. No palace. At one point, the girls were abandoned. The younger sister eventually died. The older girl survived. But her life would never resemble the world she had known inside the Red Fort. This was the true destruction of the Mughal dynasty. It wasn't simply that the throne disappeared. The entire social world surrounding the throne disappeared with it. One man who chose to help. Yet among all the stories of betrayal and suffering, there are also stories of extraordinary kindness. One of the most remarkable involves a Mughal princess named Kulsum Zamani Begum. After fleeing Delhi, she and her family were robbed of their remaining jewelry. They were exhausted and desperate. Then a local landowner named Basti came across them. He saw their condition. Instead of abandoning them, he offered help. According to Kulsum's later account, he told her, "From today, you are my sister." It was a simple sentence. But for a woman who had lost almost everything, it meant safety. Basti helped escort the family across dangerous territory. He remained with them even when helping them could bring trouble upon himself. Eventually, they found refuge. Kulsum later remembered how ordinary food tasted extraordinary after the hunger they had endured. A simple piece of millet bread could feel more precious than the finest dishes served in the imperial kitchen. That may be the greatest irony of the entire story. The Mughals had once possessed immense wealth. But when everything was taken from them, what mattered most was not gold. It was a stranger willing to say, "You are my sister." The grave is found. For more than a century, Bahadur Shah Zafar's burial place remained obscure. Then, in 1991, remains were discovered near the area associated with his burial in Yangon. A shrine was established at the site. The forgotten emperor was remembered again. Visitors came. Prayers were offered. And eventually, the grave became a place of pilgrimage. The emperor who had died in exile finally had a marked resting place. But the story of his family was far from over. The Mughals who live today. Today, descendants of the Mughal royal family still live across South Asia. Some live ordinary middle-class lives. Others have struggled with poverty. One of the most famous modern cases is Sultana Begum, the widow of Mirza Badar Bakht, who was a descendant of Bahadur Shah Zafar. She became known publicly for living in severe financial hardship in Kolkata. For years, she survived on a modest government pension and small sources of income. And yet she continued to identify herself proudly as a descendant of the Mughal dynasty. She eventually made headlines by pursuing a legal claim connected to the Red Fort. Her argument was emotional as much as historical. The Red Fort had been built by her ancestors. It had been their home. And it had been taken from them. The legal claim did not succeed. But the story captured public attention because of its extraordinary contrast. The Red Fort today is one of India's most famous monuments. Millions of people visit it. India's Prime Minister addresses the nation from its walls on Independence Day. And yet, descendants of the family that built and occupied the fort have lived in circumstances of poverty. That contrast is almost impossible to ignore. The dynasty that disappeared. The fall of the Mughals was different from many other famous dynastic collapses. The Romanovs were killed together. The Qing dynasty ended with a final emperor who later lived a very different life in communist China. The Habsburgs lost their empire but retained significant wealth and social connections. The Mughals experienced something different. They were scattered. Person by person. Family by family. City by city. Some were killed. Some were exiled. Some became servants. Some became beggars. Some simply disappeared into ordinary society. The dynasty did not die in one dramatic moment. It evaporated. And perhaps that is what makes its stories so haunting. Imagine being born into a family that had ruled India for generations. Imagine being taught that your ancestors built the Taj Mahal. Imagine growing up inside the Red Fort. And then imagine waking up one morning with no title, no property, no servants, no protection, and nowhere to go. That was the fate of thousands connected to the Mughal court. What remains? The Mughal Empire is gone. The Peacock Throne is gone. The imperial court is gone. The political dynasty is gone. But its legacy surrounds modern India. The Taj Mahal still stands. The Red Fort still stands. Mughal gardens still survive. Persianate culture shaped languages, literature, music, architecture, cuisine, and art across South Asia. And the descendants of the dynasty still exist. They are not emperors. They have no throne. They have no political power. For many, their royal ancestry provides no practical advantage at all. But the bloodline survived. And that creates an extraordinary contrast. The family that once controlled one of the wealthiest empires on earth can now be found living ordinary lives, sometimes in poverty, while millions of tourists walk through the palaces their ancestors built. Bahadur Shah Zafar once wrote a famous couplet about his fate: "How unfortunate is Zafar, for his burial, not even 2 yards of land were to be had in the land of his beloved." He wrote those words as poetry. But after his exile, they became almost painfully literal. For decades, even his grave seemed to disappear. The empire had vanished. The throne had vanished. The palace had been transformed. But the family survived. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of this story. Because empires can disappear in a generation. Palaces can become museums. Crowns can become artifacts. But people remember. The Mughals ruled for more than 3 centuries. Their empire collapsed. Their family scattered. And yet, centuries after Babur first entered India, their descendants are still here. Still carrying the name. Still telling the story. Still living in the shadow of a world that no longer exists. The Mughal Empire did not simply fall. It disappeared piece by piece until all that remained was memory. And sometimes, memory is the last thing an empire cannot destroy. If you found this story fascinating, subscribe to the channel for more forgotten chapters of history, the stories behind the empires, rulers, and people that textbooks often leave out. And tell me in the comments, should the modern descendants of former royal dynasties receive special recognition for their historical heritage, or does history belong to everyone once an empire is gone? I'll see you in the next story.